Sir, you're under arrest for trespassing on HOA property.
I'm standing on my own driveway when the cop says this. My own driveway. On land my family has owned since 1978. Behind him, Delilah Thornfield, our neighborhood's self-appointed queen, crosses her arms smugly.
I warned you about those ugly solar panels, Adrian. Nobody wants to see that trash ruining our property values.
The officer looks uncomfortable but reaches for his handcuffs. Sir, she says you won't follow HOA rules.
HOA rules?
My jaw clenches.
Officer, I'm not even part of their HOA.
Everybody in Willowbrook Estates follows our rules. No exceptions. Period.
The smell of hot asphalt rises between us as I reach into my back pocket for a piece of paper that's about to flip this whole script. What would you do if your neighbor tried to control property you don't even own? Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Let me back up and tell you how I got into this mess with Delilah Thornfield in the first place. My name's Adrian Whitmore, and I'm 52 years old. Spent 30 years as an electrician before my back finally said enough, and I took early retirement. Nothing fancy about me. I drive a 10-year-old pickup that smells like coffee and motor oil. My idea of fine dining is grilling burgers in the backyard, and I've never owned a tie that cost more than $20. The land I live on has been in my family since 1978, when my grandfather bought 47 acres of what used to be nothing but cornfields and coyote trails. Grandpa was one of those old-school farmers who believed in keeping what was his and staying out of other people's business. He built a modest farmhouse on the eastern edge of the property, where the smell of his pipe tobacco still seems to linger in the wooden beams. Fast forward to 2001. A developer comes knocking, wanting to buy most of Grandpa's land for a subdivision. Grandpa was getting old, needed the money for medical bills, but he wasn't stupid. Marcus, he told me, sitting on his porch that creaked with every word, never give away everything. Always keep something they need. He sold 38 acres, but kept the original farmhouse and, here's the important part, several key parcels scattered throughout what would become Willowbrook Estates. I inherited everything when Grandpa passed in 2003, including his advice about city folks. They'll take everything if you let them, but they'll respect you if you don't. Enter Delilah Thornfield in 2018. She moved to Willowbrook straight from some fancy suburb pharmaceutical sales manager with a BMW she washes twice a week and opinions about everything from mailbox colors to what kind of grass you should grow. The woman could probably find fault with a rainbow if it wasn't color-coordinated with her shutters. Within 6 months, she was on the HOA board. Within a year, she was president. Now, I'd been living peacefully alongside my neighbors for 15 years. Never had a problem with anybody. I keep my property clean, help neighbors with electrical work, and if someone's dog gets loose, I'll walk it back home with a smile. But Delilah had different plans. It started with her little notebook, taking pictures of my workshop, a building that's been there since Carter was president. Too rustic for her taste. Then my vegetable garden became aesthetically concerning. The sound of my table saw on Saturday mornings was suddenly a noise violation. When I politely explained I wasn't part of their HOA, she didn't back down. She escalated, started telling neighbors I was uncooperative and dragging down property values. 3 families who'd waved for years suddenly looked the other way when I drove past. That's when I discovered her pattern. She'd already forced out the Venesags over their vegetable garden, made the Johnsons remove their kids' basketball hoop, and convinced the city to make the Ramirez family tear down a perfectly legal fence. The woman was a professional bully with a HOA badge. But last month, when I installed solar panels on my roof to cut my electric bill, Delilah lost her mind. Marched over with her covenant book like she was carrying the 10 Commandments, demanding I get architectural approval for my own damn house. Every structure modification requires board review, she announced, standing in my driveway like she owned it. I'm not in your HOA, I told her. Her face went red. Everyone in Willowbrook Estates follows our rules. Period. That's when she made her first big mistake. She filed a complaint with the county claiming I was operating a non-compliant residential structure. And that's when I decided to do a little research of my own. So there I was, sitting in the county courthouse on a Tuesday morning that smelled like stale coffee and decades of bureaucratic desperation, trying to figure out exactly what Delilah thought she could accomplish with her complaint. The clerk behind the counter, a woman named Bernice who's worked there since dinosaurs roamed the earth, pulled up my property records with all the enthusiasm of someone doing their 10,000th title search. Whitmore property, Willowbrook area, she muttered, squinting at her computer screen through glasses thick enough to start fires. Honey, you've got some interesting history here. That's when I learned something my electrician buddies had always told me about property deals. Read every single line of every single document because developers love to hide things in the fine print. Turns out, when Grandpa sold that land back in 2001, he was playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. The developer bought 38 acres, sure. But Grandpa kept 9 strategic parcels scattered throughout what would become Willowbrook Estates. And according to these yellow documents that crackled when Bernice turned the pages, those parcels included some pretty important real estate. The community center where the HOA held their monthly power trips, built on my land. The playground where neighborhood kids spent their afternoons, also mine. That detention pond that kept the whole subdivision from turning into a lake every time Mother Nature sneezed. Sitting pretty on property that belonged to me. But here's where I nearly spit coffee all over Bernice's desk. The community mailbox cluster where everyone picked up their Amazon packages was also on my land. Every single day, 34 households trespassed across my property to get their mail, and they had no idea. Can you print all of this? I asked. Honey, at my age, I've seen every kind of property dispute you can imagine. But this? She gestured at the screen. This is about to get entertaining. My phone rang before I even made it to my truck. Delilah's number flashed on the screen like a warning signal. Marcus, I've organized a petition, she announced without so much as a hello. Her voice carried that special brand of smugness reserved for people who think they're about to win an argument. 23 households have signed a formal request for the county to force you into HOA compliance. I looked down at the survey maps in my hands, showing property lines that made her petition about as useful as a chocolate teapot. Is that right? The county needs to understand that your non-compliance threatens our insurance rates and property values. We have standards here, and you will follow them. The irony was so thick I could have bottled it and sold it as syrup. Delilah, can I ask you something? What? Her tone suggested she was already regretting answering her phone. When you walk to the mailbox every morning to get your pharmaceutical samples and complaint letters from other HOAs, do you ever wonder who actually owns the ground under your feet? That's common area, obviously. The developer set it aside for community use. Right. And the community center where you practice your dictatorship skills? Also common area. What's your point, Adrian? Here's where I made my first tactical decision. Sometimes the best way to handle a bully is to let them think they're winning while you quietly gather ammunition. Just curious about property lines, that's all. You know how us country folk are about knowing where our boundaries are. Well, you can be curious all you want, but you're still going to follow our rules or face the consequences. Click. She hung up on me like I was some kind of telemarketer. 3 days later, Delilah's petition landed on the county clerk's desk with all the legal weight of a paper airplane. 23 signatures demanding that Adrian Whitmore be forced to comply with established community standards and submit to HOA jurisdiction for the good of neighborhood property values. Poor Delilah. She'd just filed a formal government complaint demanding that a property owner get permission from people who were essentially squatters to modify his own land. But I wasn't ready to drop this bombshell yet. Instead, I called a professional surveyor. When Pete showed up with his GPS equipment and bag of bright orange flags, Delilah appeared at her window like she had some kind of measuring device radar. She watched him work for 3 hours, probably wondering why anyone would pay for a survey just to install some solar panels. Pete walked every inch of my property with the precision of someone who'd been doing this since surveying involved actual chains and compasses. When he finished, orange flags dotted Willowbrook Estates like confetti after a very specific kind of celebration. Your grandfather was either brilliant or lucky, Pete told me, packing up his equipment. Most developers would have demanded those key parcels as part of the sale. He kept all the spots that make a community actually function. That evening, I sat on my porch with a cold beer, looking out at all those orange flags marking my territory, and started planning phase 2 of what was about to become Delilah's very expensive education in property law. Delilah's next move came exactly 1 week later, and it proved she was either completely delusional or preparing for a career in professional overreach. I was in my workshop sanding down a cabinet for Mrs. Vanessa, the same neighbor Delilah had terrorized about her ethnic plants, when I heard car doors slamming in my driveway. Through the window dusted with sawdust that caught the afternoon light like glitter, I could see my nephew Jake's Honda Civic parked next to my truck. Walking toward him with the confidence of a federal marshal was Delilah, clipboard in hand, slapping what looked like a parking ticket under his windshield wiper. I stepped outside, still holding my sandpaper that felt rough as Delilah's personality. "Something wrong here?" She turned with that smile people use when they think they've checkmated you in chess. "Your nephew is in violation of visitor parking regulations. Section 4.7 clearly states guests must use designated visitor spaces only." Jake looked at me like someone had just announced the moon was made of cheese. "Uncle Adrian, I'm parked in your driveway." "Exactly the problem," Delilah continued, consulting her clipboard like it was the Constitution. "All parking within Willowbrook Estates must conform to community standards for aesthetic and safety compliance." Now, 30 years of electrical work teaches you about people who think they have authority they don't actually possess. I once had a homeowner try to tell me the National Electric Code didn't apply to his house because he disagreed with government overreach. Same energy, different delusion. Instead of arguing, I pulled out my phone and started recording. "So you're claiming legal authority to issue parking citations on my private property?" "On community property subject to HOA oversight, absolutely." "And my driveway is community property, how exactly?" "All residential areas within our subdivision boundaries fall under community jurisdiction for maintaining property values and neighborhood standards." The woman was basically claiming eminent domain over my driveway with the legal backing of a book club. After Delilah left, strutting back to her BMW like she'd just solved world hunger, I made a decision that would pay dividends for months. I installed security cameras around my property. Nothing fancy, just basic systems that would document exactly what was happening on my land. The footage from the first week was more entertaining than anything on Netflix. Night 1. Delilah dumping yard waste at my property line around 11 p.m., clearly operating under the cover of darkness like some kind of suburban garbage ninja. Night 3. Her husband using my land to turn around their landscaping trailer, leaving tire tracks in my grass like he owned the place. Night 5. Delilah herself creeping through my vegetable garden with a measuring tape, probably calculating how many property value points my tomatoes were costing the neighborhood. But Night 7 gave me footage that was absolutely priceless. I caught Delilah red-handed, literally, painting survey stakes. See, those orange flags Pete had placed to mark my property boundaries were apparently cramping her style. So there she was at 10:30 p.m. with a can of green spray paint, changing my bright orange property markers to match the grass. The woman was literally trying to erase my property lines. The next morning, I timed my walk to the mailbox perfectly, arriving just as Delilah was collecting her daily stack of pharmaceutical samples and neighborhood complaint forms. The air smelled like Mrs. Vanessa's honeysuckle, the same plants Delilah had tried to ban, as I approached what she still thought was community property. "Morning, Delilah. Sleep well?" She turned around with the expression of someone who'd been caught with their hand in the cookie jar. "I'm busy, Adrian." "I bet you are. Hey, quick question. Do you know what tampering with legal survey markers is called?" Her face went whiter than fresh paint. "I don't know what you're talking about." I pulled out my phone and showed her a screenshot from my security footage. There she was, clear as day, spray painting my property stakes in the middle of the night like some kind of suburban vandal. In most states, altering survey markers is a felony. Something about interfering with legal property boundaries. Funny how that works. She grabbed her mail with hands that were definitely trembling. "You're harassing residents of this community. I'm filing a restraining order." Against a man checking his mailbox on his own property? Good luck with that. As she stormed off, I realized Delilah had just made her biggest mistake yet. She'd escalated from annoying neighbor to actual criminal activity, and she'd done it all on camera. That afternoon, I made copies of everything and scheduled a meeting with a property attorney. Because if Delilah wanted to play legal games, I was about to show her what real legal authority looked like. Delilah's third escalation came 2 weeks later, and this time she'd clearly been burning the midnight oil studying local ordinances like she was cramming for the bar exam. I was up on a ladder in the Johnsons' living room replacing a ceiling fan that hummed like an angry wasp when my phone rang. The caller ID showed County Code Enforcement. Never words you want to see on a Thursday morning. "Mr. Whitmore? This is Inspector Williams. We've received a formal complaint alleging unauthorized commercial activity at your residential address." I climbed down the ladder, wiping my hands on a rag that reeked of electrical paste and 30 years of honest work. Through the Johnsons' window, I could see Delilah standing in her driveway, pretending to water plants while obviously straining to hear my conversation. Commercial activity? The complaint states you're operating an unlicensed electrical contracting business from your home, conducting commercial operations in direct violation of residential zoning codes. The woman had done her homework this time. She'd figured out that I occasionally helped neighbors with electrical problems, installing outlets, fixing switches, basic maintenance I'd been doing since retirement, and she'd turned my good neighborliness into a weapon against me. Inspector, I help friends with electrical issues. No charge, no business license needed, just neighbors helping neighbors. I understand, sir, but we're required to investigate all complaints. Can you meet me at your property tomorrow at 2 p.m.? After hanging up, I sat in the Johnson's kitchen that smelled like fresh coffee and maple syrup from their kids' breakfast and started laughing. Because while Delilah had been busy weaponizing county bureaucracy against me, I'd been doing some research of my own. My old foreman, Big Jim, taught me something valuable during a permit dispute back in '98. Marcus, he said, chomping on a cigar that could have been classified as a chemical weapon, when you're fighting City Hall, make City Hall fight itself. Government keeps records of everything, you just gotta know what to ask for. So I'd filed a Freedom of Information Act request for all public records related to the Willowbrook Estates HOA. Property tax assessments, business licenses, financial filings, the whole paper trail that bureaucrats love to generate. The files arrived in a manila envelope thick enough to stop bullets. For 15 years, the Willowbrook Estates HOA had spent exactly $847,000 on what they called community improvements and maintenance. Pool renovations that cost more than my truck, playground equipment fancier than most schools, landscaping bills that could feed a small country. But here's where it got interesting. Every single improvement had been made to facilities sitting on my land. The community center they'd renovated 3 times with granite countertops and hardwood floors, built on property I owned. That playground equipment they'd installed last spring, the kind with safety surfaces that cost more per square foot than my kitchen flooring, anchored in dirt that belonged to me. The basketball court they'd resurfaced twice, complete with professional-grade hoops, located on land I'd inherited from Grandpa. Even better, buried in the insurance paperwork like a time bomb waiting to explode, I found something that made my morning coffee taste like victory. For 15 years, the HOA had been paying liability insurance, utilities, and maintenance costs for commercial facilities on land they didn't own, didn't lease, and had no legal right to use. They'd been operating under the assumption that the original developer had secured permanent easements for community use. Turns out, assumptions and legal reality are about as compatible as cats and vacuum cleaners. When Inspector Williams showed up the next day, a guy who looked like he'd investigated every possible neighbor dispute known to mankind, I was ready with my own paperwork. Mr. Whitmore, I need to examine this commercial activity complaint. Absolutely, but while you're here, maybe you can help me understand something about commercial zoning violations. I handed him copies of my property deeds and the HOA financial records. If someone builds commercial facilities on your private property without permission and charges people money to use them, what would you call that? He studied the documents while his expression shifted from bureaucratic boredom to genuine fascination. Well, that would be unauthorized commercial use of private property, depending on the revenue involved, possibly commercial conversion without owner consent. And if they've been collecting dues from residents specifically to fund these operations, that could constitute running a commercial enterprise on private land without proper permits or owner authorization. He looked up from the papers. Mr. Whitmore, how long has this been happening? 15 years. Nearly $1 million in improvements and operating costs, all on land they have no legal right to use. Inspector Williams let out a whistle that could have called dogs from 3 counties over. Sir, I think you need to consult with an attorney before this goes any further. After he left, having found zero evidence of any commercial activity on my part, I realized that Delilah had just handed me the keys to the kingdom. She'd tried to get me in trouble for helping neighbors, while unknowingly exposing her own organization's massive, unauthorized commercial operation on my property. Time to call a lawyer and see exactly how expensive Delilah's power trip was about to become. That weekend, I was digging through Grandpa's old papers in the attic, a dusty space that smelled like mothballs and decades of forgotten Christmas decorations, when I found something that flipped this entire situation on its head. Buried in a shoebox underneath his discharge papers from Korea and a stack of seed catalogs that probably predated the internet, there was a manila folder labeled Willowbrook Development Important in Grandpa's careful handwriting that looked like it had been carved with a chisel. Inside was the original development agreement from 2001. Not the simplified summary the county had on file, but the complete contract with all its legal addendums and fine print that would make a lawyer weep with joy. I spread the papers across my kitchen table under the same lamp that Grandpa used to read his evening paper, and what I discovered made me understand why he'd always said, "Never give away everything, Adrian. Always keep something they need." The crafty old farmer hadn't just been smart about which parcels to keep. He'd been playing chess while everyone else was still learning checkers. According to Section 12 of the development agreement, Grandpa had granted the HOA a temporary easement for community facilities. Not a permanent transfer, not a sale. A 25-year renewable easement that would expire on December 31st, 2026, just 14 months away. But that wasn't even the beautiful part. This easement came with conditions that made my coffee mug rattle as I set it down. The HOA was required to maintain all community facilities to the reasonable satisfaction of the landowner. Any facility that fell into disrepair would trigger penalty clauses that Grandpa had apparently negotiated with the ruthlessness of someone who'd survived both the Korean War and 40 years of farming. I grabbed a flashlight and walked outside for my first real inspection of these premium community amenities the HOA had been bragging about for years. The basketball court looked like it had survived a small earthquake, cracks running through the asphalt like a roadmap of neglect. The playground equipment was missing safety caps, and one swing hung by a chain that belonged in a horror movie. The detention pond had turned green with algae and smelled like a biology experiment gone wrong. Back inside, I kept reading by the glow of that old lamp and found the financial nuclear weapon Grandpa had buried in the fine print. Each maintenance violation carried a penalty of $50,000, payable to the landowner within 30 days of written notice. I counted 14 separate violations from my 10-minute inspection, $700,000 in penalties that the HOA had unknowingly accumulated, plus the original easement was expiring anyway. And if I chose not to renew, the HOA had exactly 60 days to remove all structures and restore the land to its original condition, at their own expense. I leaned back in my kitchen chair and calculated demolition costs. The community center would cost at least $200,000 to tear down and haul away. Add the playground, basketball court, and detention pond restoration, and we were looking at another $150,000, plus regrading and reseeding the entire area. Close to $1 million in removal costs, on top of the penalty fees, on top of 15 years of back rent I could legally claim. Delilah's power trip had accidentally put her precious HOA in a financial hole deeper than the detention pond they'd been ignoring. For the first time since this mess started, I wasn't the underdog. I was holding cards that could bankrupt the entire association. But more than that, I realized every neighbor Delilah had bullied deserved to see what happened when someone finally had the legal authority to fight back against petty tyranny. Time to call Rebecca Santos and find out exactly how expensive fake authority was about to become. Monday morning, I sat in Rebecca Santos's law office, surrounded by the smell of leather-bound legal books and freshly brewed coffee that probably cost more per cup than I spent on groceries in a week. Rebecca was the kind of lawyer who wore power suits like armor and had a reputation for eating property disputes for breakfast. "Marcus," she said, spreading Grandpa's contract across her mahogany desk like she was laying out battle plans. "Your grandfather was either a legal genius or he had one hell of an attorney. He always said he learned more about contracts from buying farm equipment than most lawyers learn in school." Rebecca laughed, a sound that probably made opposing counsel nervous in courtrooms. "Well, he certainly understood leverage. This easement agreement gives you more power than most landlords have over their tenants." She walked me through the legal mechanics with the patience of someone who'd explained property law to confused landowners 1,000 times before. The maintenance violations I documented were clear-cut breaches of contract. Each penalty was enforceable in court. And the most beautiful part? The HOA had unknowingly waived their right to dispute the landowner's assessment of what constituted reasonable maintenance standards. So I can basically define what's acceptable? Within reason, yes. And looking at these photos you took, I'd say your standards are more than reasonable. They're generous. Back home, I started what Rebecca called building the file, documenting every violation with the thoroughness of someone who'd spent 30 years writing electrical inspection reports. I photographed cracked pavement, measured gaps in safety fencing, and documented every broken piece of playground equipment with the kind of detail that would make insurance adjusters weep. But I wasn't working alone anymore. Mrs. Vanessa knocked on my door Tuesday evening, carrying a plate of homemade dumplings that smelled like heaven and a manila envelope that looked like trouble. "Marcus, I've been keeping records," she said, settling into my kitchen chair with the determination of someone who'd finally found an ally. Every time Delilah harassed me about my garden, every complaint she filed, every nasty letter she left in my mailbox. The envelope contained 3 years of documentation proving a pattern of targeted harassment that would make any reasonable person's blood boil, letters demanding she remove non-native plants that don't fit community aesthetics. Photos Delilah had taken of Mrs. Vanessa's vegetable garden with complaints about unsightly agricultural activity in a residential area. Even a petition Delilah had circulated trying to ban foreign cooking smells from the neighborhood. "She tried to make me feel like I didn't belong here," Mrs. Vanessa said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd endured too much in silence. "But this is my home." Wednesday brought Jake, my nephew, with news that made the whole situation even more interesting. "Uncle Adrian, you know how you asked me to research property values in the subdivision?" He pulled out his laptop, screen glowing with real estate data that told a fascinating story. Turns out, houses closest to your community facilities sell for $20,000 to $30,000 more than identical houses on the other side of the neighborhood. The irony was perfect. Delilah had been claiming my non-compliance threatened property values, while her neighbor's house prices were actually inflated because of amenities built on my land. By Thursday, word had quietly spread through the neighborhood grapevine that Mrs. Vanessa waters better than the local news station. 3 more families came forward with their own Delilah horror stories. The Johnsons showed me letters threatening legal action over their kids' sidewalk chalk art. The Rodriguez family had receipts for the fence they'd been forced to rebuild 3 times because Delilah kept claiming it violated sightline regulations she'd apparently invented. Sarah Martinez, the young mother from Pine Street, brought something even better, a recording. "I started recording our HOA meetings when Delilah began targeting families with children," Sarah explained, playing audio on her phone that sounded like a dictator addressing her subjects. "Listen to this from last month's meeting." Delilah's voice crackled through the speaker. "Some residents seem to think they can ignore community standards just because they're not explicitly written down. Well, I'm here to tell you that maintaining property values requires vigilance against any element that threatens our neighborhood character." "She never names anyone specifically," Sarah continued, "but everyone knows who she's talking about. It's psychological warfare disguised as community leadership." Friday evening, I sat on my porch with a beer and a legal pad, planning what Rebecca had called the resolution strategy. The goal wasn't just to win, it was to create a situation where Delilah's bullying would finally have consequences while protecting the neighbors who'd suffered under her fake authority. Rebecca had explained the timeline. I could file formal notice of the maintenance violations, giving the HOA 30 days to cure the breaches or pay the penalties. I could also announce my intention not to renew the easement, starting the 60-day countdown for facility removal. But timing was everything. I needed maximum witnesses, media attention, and community support when this went public. That's when I had the idea that would turn Delilah's next power play into her final performance. I was going to throw a community barbecue. Delilah's response to my newfound legal research was swift, desperate, and completely predictable. She called an emergency HOA meeting for the following Tuesday, sending out notices that read like declarations of war. "Urgent. Community standards crisis requiring immediate action," was the subject line on emails that hit every homeowner's inbox like digital panic buttons. I wasn't invited, obviously, but Mrs. Vanessa was, and she'd become my unofficial intelligence operative in this suburban Cold War. "She's losing her mind," Mrs. Vanessa reported, sitting in my kitchen Wednesday morning with tea that steamed like her anger. "Delilah stood up there claiming you're a threat to property values and community safety. She wants to assess every household $15,000 for legal fees to force you into compliance. $15,000 per household to pay lawyers to fight a battle they'd already lost." How'd that go over? About like you'd expect. The Hendersons walked out, 3 board members resigned on the spot. Janet Morrison asked if Delilah had completely lost her mind, and I quote, "because this sounds like extortion." But Delilah wasn't done. Thursday afternoon, she showed up at my front door with a briefcase that probably cost more than my monthly electric bill and the kind of smile people wear when they think they're about to deliver a knockout punch. "Marcus, I have a proposition for you." I invited her in, mostly because I was curious to see how deep this hole she was digging would go. She settled into my living room chair like she was negotiating a hostage situation. The community recognizes that there may have been some misunderstandings about property boundaries, she began, opening her briefcase to reveal a stack of documents that looked official enough to fool people who didn't read the fine print. Is that right? We're prepared to offer you $25,000 to resolve this situation amicably. You sign these papers acknowledging our right to maintain community facilities, and everyone can move on peacefully. I picked up the contract and started reading. It was beautiful in its desperation, a document that would have given the HOA permanent ownership of my land for about 50 cents on the dollar, while waiving all my legal claims for violations they hadn't even fixed yet. This is interesting, Delilah, but I'm curious about something. What's that? Have you actually read the original development agreement between my grandfather and the builder? Her confident expression flickered like a candle in the wind. Of course, that's standard due diligence. So you know the easement expires December 31st of next year? The flicker became a full-blown power outage. There might be automatic renewal clauses. And you're aware of the maintenance standards requirements and penalty structure? She stood up so fast her briefcase scattered papers across my coffee table like legal confetti. Marcus, you're playing a very dangerous game. The community won't stand for one person holding everyone hostage. Hostage? I'm not the one demanding $15,000 from every family in the neighborhood. After she left, I made copies of her attempted bribery contract and added it to the file Rebecca was building. Because apparently, when you corner someone like Delilah, they don't surrender gracefully. They double down on stupid. Friday brought news that made the whole situation even more surreal. Mrs. Vanessa called with updates from the neighborhood gossip network that operated more efficiently than the internet. Delilah's hired private security for the next HOA meeting, she reported, her voice carrying the disbelief of someone watching a community board meeting turn into a military operation. 2 guards, supposedly to maintain order and prevent disruption. Disruption from who? Anyone who asks questions she doesn't want to answer, apparently. But the real entertainment came Saturday morning, when I discovered Delilah had escalated her campaign to social media. Someone had created a Facebook group called Willowbrook Estates Property Values Alert, with exactly one administrator and a series of posts that read like the manifesto of someone who'd spent too much time alone with their own anger. The posts painted me as everything from a dangerous recluse to a communist infiltrator trying to destroy suburban family values. My personal favorite was the one claiming my solar panels were a deliberate attack on the aesthetic integrity that makes our community a desirable place to raise children. The comments section was even better. Neighbors who'd been quietly enduring Delilah's tyranny for years were finally speaking up, sharing their own stories of harassment and intimidation. The group had become an accidental support network for everyone she'd bullied. By Sunday, I realized Delilah had made her fatal mistake. She'd declared war on the entire community in my name, turning neighbors who might have stayed neutral into allies who were finally ready to see her reign of petty terror end. Rebecca called that evening with perfect timing. Marcus, I finished reviewing everything. When you're ready to file those violation notices, we can do it publicly. Maybe at some kind of community gathering where everyone can hear exactly what's been happening on their behalf. I looked out my window at all those houses filled with families who deserved better than living under Delilah's manufactured authority. Rebecca, how do you feel about barbecues? Delilah's final desperate move came exactly 1 week before my planned community barbecue, and it confirmed everything I'd suspected about her character. It started with whispers, the kind of neighborhood rumors that spread like wildfire through text messages and coffee shop conversations. Mrs. Vanessa called Tuesday morning with a voice tight with anger. Marcus, she's telling people you threatened her. Claims you said you'd make her pay for standing up to you. I was in my workshop, sanding a bookshelf that would never see the light of day if Delilah got her way, when the implications hit me. The smell of cedar shavings and the familiar weight of the sandpaper in my hands couldn't distract me from the fact that she was trying to paint me as unstable and dangerous. That's complete fabrication. But it gets worse. She's also spreading stories about you watching her house with binoculars and following her to the grocery store. Wednesday brought an escalation that crossed every line of decency I thought existed in suburban warfare. A Knox County Sheriff's deputy knocked on my door just as I was finishing my morning coffee, holding a temporary restraining order petition that read like fiction, written by someone with a grudge and a law degree. "Mr. Whitmore, I need to serve you with this petition for a protection order. You have a hearing scheduled for Friday at 2 p.m. The document was a masterpiece of creative writing. According to Delilah's sworn statement, I had engaged in a pattern of stalking, harassment, and intimidation designed to force her from her home and community leadership position. She claimed I'd made veiled threats about financial retaliation and had weaponized legal technicalities to terrorize law-abiding homeowners. The most creative part? She alleged that my security cameras were positioned specifically to invade her privacy and monitor her daily activities in violation of reasonable expectations of personal safety. I called Rebecca immediately. "This is desperation disguised as legal strategy," she said after I read her the petition over the phone. "She's trying to control the narrative before your barbecue, make you look like the aggressor before people hear the truth about who's been doing what to whom. Can she win? Not with the evidence we have, but she can cause you embarrassment and delay your plans. That's probably the point." Thursday evening brought the news that made me realize Delilah had completely lost touch with reality. Jake called with an update from his girlfriend, who worked at the bank where Delilah had apparently tried to hire a private investigator. "Uncle Adrian, she wanted someone to dig up dirt on you. Financial problems, criminal history, anything that would discredit you before the HOA meeting. Did she find anyone?" The PI laughed her out of the office, told her that trying to investigate someone for legally enforcing property rights was like hiring a detective to prove the sky is blue. But Friday's court hearing was where Delilah's desperation reached its peak performance. She showed up dressed like she was testifying before Congress, with a binder full of evidence that included enlarged photographs of my security cameras, printouts of my property deed with angry yellow highlighter marks, and a timeline of escalating aggressive behavior that read like a conspiracy theory. Her testimony was a work of fiction that would have made Hollywood screenwriters jealous. According to Delilah, I was a dangerous loner who'd infiltrated a peaceful community with the specific intention of destroying property values and terrorizing families. She claimed my legal research was actually surveillance and intelligence gathering, designed to harm law-abiding citizens. Judge Patricia Morrison, a woman who'd apparently heard every kind of neighbor dispute imaginable, listened with the patience of someone who'd been dealing with suburban drama since the Clinton administration. When it was my turn to present evidence, I simply handed over copies of the original development agreement, the HOA financial records, and photographs of the maintenance violations Delilah's organization had been ignoring for years. "Your Honor," I said, "Ms. Thornfield is asking for protection from a landowner who discovered that her organization has been operating commercial facilities on his property without permission, while spending nearly $1 million in community funds on improvements to land they don't own." Judge Morrison studied the documents for what felt like an hour, then looked at Delilah with the expression of someone who'd just realized they'd been listening to a very elaborate lie. "Ms. Thornfield, this appears to be a civil property dispute that you've attempted to reframe as a personal safety issue. Petition denied." As we left the courthouse, Delilah tried one last desperate move. She approached me in the parking lot with tears that looked about as genuine as a $3 bill. "Marcus, please, can't we work something out? This is tearing our community apart." "Delilah, you've spent 2 years bullying every neighbor who wouldn't bow to your fake authority. Now you're upset because someone finally has real legal standing to push back?" She got in her BMW and drove away, but I could see in her rearview mirror that this was far from over. Saturday's barbecue was going to be her last stand, whether she realized it or not. Time to let the entire community see exactly who had been wielding real power all along. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of perfect weather that makes you believe in cosmic justice. Clear skies, gentle breeze, and the smell of possibility hanging in the air like barbecue smoke. I'd sent invitations to every household in Willowbrook Estates, plus the township supervisor, county commissioner, and that reporter from the local newspaper who specialized in municipal government stories. The invitation was simple. Community barbecue on the Whitmore property. Come learn about your neighborhood's real history. By noon, 47 people had gathered on my land, including families I hadn't seen outside their houses in years. Mrs. Vanessa brought homemade potato salad that could have ended wars. The Johnsons arrived with their kids and that basketball they'd been forced to put away. Even some HOA board members showed up, looking like people who'd finally decided to hear both sides of a story. I was flipping burgers on a grill that had seen better decades when County Commissioner Webb arrived with Township Supervisor Martinez. Both carried the slightly wary expressions of public officials who'd learned that simple neighbor disputes were never simple. "Marcus, appreciate the invitation," Commissioner Webb said, accepting a beer with the relief of someone whose Saturday afternoon just got more interesting. "Word is you've got some property issues to discuss. Nothing too complicated, just thought people should know where they're standing when they come to community events." That's when Delilah arrived. She pulled up in her BMW like she was leading a motorcade, followed by a Knox County Sheriff's deputy she'd apparently convinced to make a welfare check on what she'd reported as a potentially volatile gathering of agitated property owners. The deputy, a young guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, approached with the careful steps of someone walking through a minefield. "Afternoon, folks. Got a call about a possible disturbance?" Commissioner Webb laughed, a sound that carried across the yard like rolling thunder. "Son, the only disturbance here is that potato salad disappearing faster than tax money in an election year." Delilah marched across the lawn with a folder thick enough to bludgeon someone, heading straight for the cluster of people gathered around my picnic table where I'd spread out copies of the development agreement and property surveys. "Marcus Whitmore, this gathering is in violation of HOA community standards and you're conducting it on property subject to homeowner association jurisdiction." The yard went quiet except for the sizzle of burgers on the grill and the sound of children playing on playground equipment that was about to become very expensive to relocate. I set down my spatula and picked up my grandfather's original land deed, the same yellowed paper that had started this whole adventure. "Delilah, I'd like everyone here to understand exactly whose property we're standing on." Commissioner Webb stepped forward with the instincts of someone who'd seen enough public meetings turn into theater. "Marcus, why don't you walk us through what you've discovered?" I handed him the development agreement and pointed toward the community center that gleamed in the afternoon sun like a monument to misplaced confidence. 25 years ago, my grandfather granted your HOA a temporary easement to build community facilities on 9 parcels of his land. That easement expires December 31st, 2026, 14 months from today. Delilah's face went through more color changes than a traffic light. "That's impossible. The developer assured us those were permanent common areas." "The developer didn't own the land. My grandfather did. And according to this agreement, your organization has accumulated over $700,000 in maintenance violation penalties while spending nearly $1 million on improvements to property you have no legal right to own." Township Supervisor Martinez whistled low under his breath. "Marcus, are you saying the HOA has been operating these facilities without proper land rights?" "For 15 years, and collecting dues from homeowners to maintain facilities on someone else's property." The deputy looked at his notebook, then at Delilah, then back at me. "Ma'am, exactly what law is being broken here?" That's when Sarah Martinez, the young mother who'd been recording HOA meetings, stepped forward with her phone. "Officer, maybe you should hear what Ms. Thornfield said about property ownership at last month's meeting." She played the audio of Delilah declaring that maintaining property values requires vigilance against any element that threatens our neighborhood character, words that now sounded less like community leadership and more like the manifesto of someone drunk on imaginary power. Commissioner Webb studied the documents with the thoroughness of someone who'd spent decades untangling municipal messes. "Ms. Thornfield, it appears your organization has been operating commercial facilities on private property without the owner's permission while assessing fees from residents for improvements you had no legal authority to make." Delilah looked around the yard full of neighbors who were finally hearing the truth, at the county officials who were taking notes, at the reporter who was scribbling furiously. "This is ridiculous. Everyone knows these are common areas." I handed Township Supervisor Martinez the formal notice Rebecca had prepared. "Actually, as of Monday, the HOA has 30 days to cure all maintenance violations or pay the assessed penalties, and 60 days to negotiate a new lease agreement or remove all structures and restore the land to its original condition." The yard erupted in conversations as neighbors realized what they'd been witnessing and paying for all these years. Delilah stood beside her BMW holding her useless folder of fake authority, finally understanding that her 2-year reign of suburban tyranny was over. The aftermath of Saturday's barbecue unfolded faster than anyone expected, including me. By Monday morning, Delilah had submitted her resignation as HOA president via email, a two-sentence message that managed to sound bitter even in Times New Roman font. By Tuesday, the remaining board members had scheduled an emergency meeting to elect new leadership and figure out how to navigate the financial reality I'd dropped in their lap. The new board president turned out to be Janet Morrison, a retired teacher who'd been quietly enduring Delilah's tyranny while documenting every violation of proper meeting procedures. Janet called me Wednesday evening with a proposal that proved some people actually understand the difference between leadership and dictatorship. Marcus, we'd like to negotiate a fair lease agreement for the community facilities, something that works for everyone and doesn't bankrupt the association. We settled on a 10-year renewable lease for $2,000 per month, roughly half the fair market rate, with the HOA responsible for maintaining everything to reasonable standards. In exchange, I waived the $700,000 in accumulated penalties and agreed to let them phase in the monthly payments over 6 months. More importantly, the new agreement included a community bill of rights that prohibited targeting individual homeowners over aesthetic preferences, required board approval before filing any external complaints, and established an appeal process for residents who felt unfairly treated. Mrs. Vanessa was the first to benefit from the new regime. Within 2 weeks, she'd replanted her vegetable garden with pride instead of fear, and started a neighborhood seed exchange that turned out to be more popular than the old community center meetings ever were. The Johnsons' kids got their basketball hoop back, along with permission to use the actual basketball court without worrying about noise complaints. Jake started organizing pickup games that brought together families who'd been avoiding each other for years. Sarah Martinez launched a playground committee that turned the neglected equipment into something that actually met safety standards while teaching kids about community cooperation instead of arbitrary rule following. But the real transformation happened gradually, in ways that restored what a neighborhood should actually be. People started waving again when they walked to the mailbox. Kids played in front yards without parents worrying about citation letters. Mrs. Vanessa's cooking smells became a dinner bell that reminded everyone what home actually smells like. 3 months later, I used the lease income to establish something Grandpa would have loved: the Willowbrook Trades Scholarship, providing $5,000 annually to local high school graduates pursuing careers in electrical work, plumbing, carpentry, and other skilled trades that keep communities functioning. The first recipient was Jake's girlfriend, who'd been accepted into the electrician's apprenticeship program at the community college. Grandpa always said the real wealth in any community comes from people who know how to fix things when they break. 6 months after the barbecue, we held our first Good Neighbor Day festival on my property, celebrating cooperation over compliance and community over control. Delilah didn't attend. She'd moved to a different subdivision where she promptly joined their HOA board. Some people never learn. But everyone else showed up, including families from neighboring subdivisions who'd heard about our transformation from dictatorship to democracy. The county commissioner gave a speech about property rights. Mrs. Vanessa won the chili cook-off. The Johnson kids taught other children that basketball is supposed to be fun, not forbidden. As the sun set on a day that proved communities work better when people respect each other instead of fearing arbitrary authority, I sat on my porch with a beer and thought about Grandpa's wisdom. Always keep something they need, Adrian. He'd been talking about land, but the principle was bigger than property lines. Every community needs someone willing to stand up when power gets out of hand, someone who understands that real authority comes from serving others, not controlling them. The detention pond is crystal clear now, maintained by volunteers who understand they're protecting their own investment. The playground equipment gets inspected monthly by parents who know their kids deserve safe places to play. The community center hosts meetings where people actually listen to each other instead of being lectured about compliance. And my solar panels. They're still generating clean energy and driving down my electric bill, completely free from HOA interference, on land that my family has owned since 1978.